Hey guys, Crypto Dad here again, and as we approach a new all-time high for the price of Bitcoin, I wanted to give you a few thoughts and reflections that I've gathered over the years. And your big question might be, why Bitcoin? Well, as we approach a new all-time high, a new segment of the population is sitting up and taking notice of Bitcoin. Maybe for the first time, or maybe they've heard about Bitcoin before, but it has faded from their awareness. Well, here we are again. We had an all-time high around 20,000 in 2017. We had another all-time high around 68,000 in 2021. We had an all-time high in March of this year of 73,600 approximately, and now we're approaching a new all-time high. So over all that time, as Bitcoin rose in value, it had its detractors. It's a scam. It's a Ponzi scheme. It's based on nothing. It's worthless. They always refer to Bitcoin as the bubble that has already popped, or the Ponzi scheme that has already collapsed. But as time went on and Bitcoin just wouldn't go away, they invented new narratives: regulatory scrutiny, financial instability, volatility. Bitcoin was bad for the environment. Bitcoin used too much electricity. Bitcoin wasn't green. Well, Bitcoin has survived all of the naysayers, and we are again approaching an all-time high. So what does that say about Bitcoin? Well, for one thing, it says that Bitcoin is here to stay and it's not going anywhere. But what exactly is Bitcoin, and why should I be concerned about it? How can it help me? Well, a lot of people say that Bitcoin is a good investment, and it is. If you had purchased Bitcoin in 2017, even at the top of the bubble that popped or the Ponzi scheme that collapsed, that Bitcoin that you bought for 20,000 would be worth 70,000 today. That's a pretty good return on investment. But Bitcoin is more than just an investment. Bitcoin is a decentralized currency that's not controlled by any banks or governments. Bitcoin is a computer program that maintains a ledger that is stored on hundreds and thousands of nodes spread out all across the world. They maintain an immutable ledger or record of all of the Bitcoin transactions through history and all of the current balances of all the separate Bitcoin wallets. The Bitcoin software program is maintained on GitHub by a community of developers. The Bitcoin network is powered by a community of Bitcoin miners, and the Bitcoin ecosystem is powered by a community of users all over the world. You could be one of them. Bitcoin is the apex of currency. We started off bartering things, and then in ancient times we moved to coins. In the late Middle Ages we moved to paper money, and in the 20th century we moved to digital money. But it's always been centralized, controlled by banks and governments. Bitcoin is the first decentralized currency that is not controlled by any centralized authority. You can send value across the room or across the world with equal ease. Now, a lot of people ask me in my comment sections and in my live stream, what is your exit strategy for Bitcoin? Well, of course, we always can think about Bitcoin in terms of dollars, and if I were to need money in an emergency, such as my kids needing braces or something like that, I would sell my Bitcoin for dollars. Of course, if you need money, you can sell your Bitcoin. But my long-term goal is not really to think about Bitcoin in terms of its value in dollars. My long-term goal would be to think of a time in the future where I would say to myself, how many Satoshis will it take to buy that loaf of bread? How many Satoshis will it cost me for that cup of coffee? How much Bitcoin will I need to buy that car or buy that house? we should start thinking in terms of Bitcoin being the measurement of value in our life. Right now, when we look around, we think of things in terms of dollar value. But the ultimate goal with Bitcoin adoption should be thinking in terms of Bitcoin value. And so you might say, well, that's all well and good, but why do we need Bitcoin? Don't we have a monetary system? Aren't things working pretty well the way things are? I mean, everything seems to be fine, right? Well, are you fine? Think about it. Look around. What are the biggest problems in your life? What do you think about on a day-to-day basis? What keeps you up at night? It's usually bills or debt or your job. We're all chasing money, and most of us are swimming in debt. Why is that? It's because of the massive Ponzi scheme known as the fiat monetary system. But it hasn't always been this way. When this country was founded originally, most of the people were farmers and very self-sufficient. Most people grew their own food. Most people made their own clothes. They even had a surplus from their crops after harvest time that they could use to buy other things that they needed. But on the whole, most people in the U.S. were self-sufficient. They didn't really rely on the government or banks for anything. But that has changed over time. And why is that? It wasn't an overnight transition. It happened slowly over time, and there were many dominoes that fell along the way. One of the major ones was the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which established a national bank. Now, we had had national banks in the past, but they had been rejected largely by the people. Andrew Jackson famously fought against one of the national banks. In fact, he referred to bankers as a den of vipers. But somehow in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act got passed. It was passed off as some sort of anti-banking measure and was finally ratified by the Senate on December 23, 1913, when no one was really paying attention a few days before Christmas. But make no mistake, the Federal Reserve is about as federal as Federal Express. We've been led to believe that it's some sort of government agency, but it is not. It is a private consortium of bankers. The only influence that the U.S. government has on the Federal Reserve is that the executive branch appoints the governors. But all of these governors come from a pool of bankers put forward by their own. Next, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, which established the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency of the world. This allowed the U.S. government, U.S. banks, and U.S. companies to purchase real-world goods for paper dollars. But they were still hampered. The U.S. dollar was tied to the price of gold. But that fell apart in 1971, where France suddenly got wise and realized that they had a whole bunch of dollars in their safes, and they'd been selling us real-world goods for many years. And they decided, hey, I think I'd like to get my gold for all these dollars. Well, it didn't take long for the U.S. government and President Nixon to take the United States dollar off the gold standard on November 15, 1971, an event referred to as the Nixon shock. So now the only thing backing the U.S. dollar is the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. And that may seem okay, but not having a gold requirement for dollars allows the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve to print dollars like it's going out of style. Many of you have heard of fractional reserve banking. This basically allows a bank to lend out more money than it actually has on hand. Fractional reserve banking can be a 10-to-1 ratio, sometimes even higher. It allows a bank to lend out 10 times more money than they actually have on hand. This works out pretty well because most people don't usually come in demanding all of the cash out of their bank accounts at the same time. And of course, these rules are hard and fast, so all banks have to abide by them. But in March of 2020, the Federal Reserve made the decision to remove reserve requirements completely from banks and take that down to a 0% requirement in reaction to the COVID crisis. This was to improve liquidity and allow banks to continue to function during the crisis. Well, guess what? The crisis is over, but the Federal Reserve never rescinded that decision. They have never returned to the fractional reserve percentage requirements that were in place before the COVID crisis. So I asked my ChatGPT to explain this situation to me, and it let me know that the Fed has not reinstated a non-zero reserve requirement. Instead, it manages liquidity and the federal funds rate using interest on reserve balances, IORB, and overnight reserve repurchase agreements, which have replaced the traditional reserve requirements as the primary tools for influencing bank reserves and lending behavior. So it's a lot of hand waving and shadow banking maintaining our system now. So basically, it's a license to print money out of thin air. But how does this affect me, you might say? Well, we all live in a debt-based society. You could think of us as debt slaves. We're swimming in debt. We're swimming in credit card debt. We're swimming in household debt. We're swimming in mortgage debt. We're swimming in auto loan debts. Almost everyone in the U.S. has some level of debt. And if you don't, you're pretty much living hand to mouth. And why is this? Well, it's because the fiat money Ponzi scheme requires debt. It thrives on debt. It lives on debt. It must create more debt to survive. And why is this? In a nutshell, if we had an economy based on just $1 and the banks lent out 10 dimes to 10 different people and expected them all to pay interest on those loans, where would that interest come from? Since we only have 10 dimes in the economy, that interest repayment has to come from somewhere. Well, it comes from more debt. And let's expand that system to the entire monetary system of the U.S. People are getting charged interest on all this debt, and this interest has to come from somewhere. The only way to keep the system alive is to keep expanding, keep adding more debt. Why do you think your mailbox is full of credit card offers? It's because they need more debt to fuel this rapacious beast known as the fiat money Ponzi scheme. And not only do we have the problem of debt in our economy, which keeps us up at night wondering how we're going to make ends meet, we also have inflation. These types of monetary policies cause inflation, and inflation is pervasive. It's everywhere. We always hear about inflation. They'll say the rate of inflation has gone up or the rate of inflation has gone down. Inflation is 2%, 3%. Some people claim that the real figures for inflation are closer to 10 or 20%. But think about that. It's always a rate. It's always a percentage, which means that inflation is always going up. We never have 0% inflation. We never have negative inflation. When we hear good news, they'll say things like, wow, inflation has gone from 2.5% down to 2.1%. Isn't that grand? Well, it still means that inflation is going up and inflation is getting higher. That's one of the reasons that your grandmother would probably faint if she saw you spending $100 on a couple of bags of groceries. And believe me, inflation is not some sort of unintended consequence. It's done on purpose. If a government needs to raise money, they can do it in a couple of different ways. One of them is taxing the populace, and the other is just printing more money. Well, taxing the populace isn't too popular people tend to get irritated when their taxes go up and vote their politicians out of office. So it's much easier for the government to just print more money when they need something. But this creates what's called a shadow tax or a hidden tax, because when inflation goes up, the populace ends up paying more for their day-to-day purchases. But because it's such a subtle thing, we don't really think about it in terms of something that's being done to us. We just think of it as the way things are. We're like fish swimming in the ocean. The fish don't really think about the ocean or water. It's just the way things are. And that's the way most people are in the US when it comes to inflation and debt. We just figure that's the way things are. So a reasonable question might occur to you. If the government can print money out of thin air, why do they need my taxes? Well, the answer is they really don't. They could just print money out of thin air all the time. But taxes achieve two things. One, it keeps us under their thumb. And number two, if they declare that they no longer need taxes to maintain the economy, their naked Ponzi scheme would be exposed to the light of day. The emperor would be revealed to be not wearing any clothes. So here we are. Those are our two biggest problems, debt and inflation. But it would be great if we could escape that system. Is Bitcoin the answer? Possibly. Is Bitcoin perfect? Not by any means. Bitcoin needs to scale more. Blockchain fees are getting higher. It's not really the system that was originally intended, so it needs improvement. Fees should be almost negligible, and the speed of transactions should be much faster. Is it the answer to all of our monetary problems? Maybe not, but it's a good start. It is an escape from the debt cycle of our current fiat monetary system. Well, what can you do? It's easy. Buy a little Bitcoin. You can get it just about anywhere. There are exchanges where you can purchase Bitcoin, like Coinbase, Kraken, or Gemini if you're in the US, or Binance if you're international. You can purchase Bitcoin on Venmo or PayPal. So it's not really that hard to lay your hands on some Bitcoin. But if you do, the most important thing to remember is self-custody. You need to store your Bitcoin in your own wallet. Be part of the solution. Is it going to fix all your problems overnight? Probably not. But as I mentioned before, it's a good start.